Okay, yeah, cool. I'm good to go then if everyone's ready. If you want me to send a doc, I can. Like, I won't be going particularly fast, and I think it should be a trad round, but whatever you want.
I would like it if you could send it in email or file share.
That's fine. Yeah, I'll put it on the file share. I can email it if you want, but due to my school email, it might not come through like immediately. I think the file share would be the best bet.
Yeah, I think NSD already, like the campus already has the
Yeah,
feature.
that's cool. Okay, cool. I put it in there as like a card thing. I don't know necessarily if I'll be reading the same exact order or like read every card, but like I'll try to make it clear what I am and I'm not reading. So, but like at least that's all the evidence I'm reading, if that's cool. Cool. Is everyone ready then? Just want to confirm the last judge is ready and then I'll start. Okay, cool. All right. I affirm resolved the United States military ought to abide by a principle of non-intervention. Will define military per Canadian 19 as including those in the armed services, the special operations forces, DoD, contractors, and national security organizations. Non-intervention from Merriam-Webster as a policy of non-intervening. The value is morality, given that the resolution inherently asks a question of a moral objective. The value criterion is utilitarianism, that is, the maximum pleasure and least pain for the most people. That's because every decision has trade-offs, and we need a way to analyze them. The University of Kansas writes in 2014 that util is the most well-suited way of thinking to make large-scale policy decisions, because they involve trade-offs, and util provides a framework for making those trade-offs in a way that promotes the common good the most. Contention 1 is the South China Sea. U.S. actions in Venezuela have eroded international norms and mirror Chinese security operations. That's Zhao from January 7th. U.S. attack on Venezuela raised questions about checks on power and signal challenge to norms. Analysts assess military capabilities and willingness to deploy them. China believes Washington execute superiority. Might makes right. China prioritizes accumulation and readiness of hard power, and the competition deepens. Policymakers, through information control and echo chambers, believe their policies are right. But controversial actions matter greatly. Leaders lower their thresholds, norms become comparative. They only believe they are worse than West rivals. This regard for norms, dissent voices in China are now indifferent. The erosion of debate gives way to more assertive security policy. Washington community accept U.S. actions, convinces Beijing that a military move against Taiwan would be more justifiable. The framing of the Venezuela operation as a law enforcement closely mirrors China's characterization of plans against Taiwan. And new Trump developments are perceived as more aggressive. They are from February 27th. The South China Sea is shaped by action-reaction cycle of confrontation. To disrupt U.S. activities in Taiwan, great power contestation, the U.S. increased maritime activities, including 1 bilateral and 7 multilateral exercises. The risk of accident prompts Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty. Negotiations will be difficult. Manila does not approve a non-binding COC, while Beijing is unlikely to agree to any agreement that is binding or restricts guards. Thus, there's 3 links. First is the military. China is rapidly militarizing now to hedge against the US. AFP from 3-4 explains that Beijing spends $276 billion to carry out defense projects over the next 5 years. The budget will finance maneuvers over Taiwan and cyber war. Without military, our stance will be dictated by the US. China strengthens its capabilities to restore jurisdiction over the islands. And because of the U.S. investment in Iran, continued intervention makes China seize the opportunity. They see what we're doing and they want a part. Kaharo explains in March 6 that the whole left in defenses of Washington diverted ships and missiles used to deter China. A prolonged conflict can harm stability. Tokyo sought assurances that it would not shift to U.S. military assets. The U.S. is stretched thin. Skip the rest. The second link is self-defense. The Iranian war has stretched the self-defense means, so now countries can escalate further in the name of self-defense. Let's play it all in 2026. Iran war makes a Chinese invasion more likely. Partners are diminishing weapons. The war stretches the boundaries of self-defense, makes it easier for China to legitimize efforts to take Taiwan by force. That's because the normalization has led to more international agreement. Taipei Times explains in March 6 that normalization becomes routine, anticipated threat becomes available, in East Asia that has explosive implications. And the third link is intervention. It's actively driving escalation. Thornton explains in 20 that rather than current approach, the U.S. should seek a modus vivendi. Attempts to counter Chinese behavior have not been successful. These include attempts at a binding code of conduct and increased military presence. China's position has hardened. China views the South China Sea as periphery, important to defending its perceived threats. These include U.S. intervention. South China Sea is crucial for continued development. U.S. relations will inevitably pull the U.S. into conflict and dial down the possibility. Skip the rest. Unfortunately, anything else other than changing risks run-ins, which leads to escalation. Cynthia Wells explains on March 5th that the Chinese claims over 9-dash liner met with U.S. naval assets. The critical shipping route was rich in resources, heightening tensions. The trade war and the presence of the U.S. carrier is seen as a direct challenge. The dispute has geopolitical implications, can shape the balance of power in Asia Pacific and beyond. It would enhance its position and challenge global order. This emboldens China to be more assertive in other areas. Unfortunately, a conflict goes nuclear. Klopp explains in 24 that South China Sea clarifies Washington's stance in other hotspots. China kept building up military structures to push the U.S. Navy out. Collisions can escalate, risk of conflagration. The busiest waterways can close off trade. If China sees South Korea, determine if it opens a nuclear umbrella, as would Japan and NATO in Putin's crosshairs. All alliances would lose value, triggering nuclear arms races and aggression. All conflicts are existential. The U.S. would go to war. But nuclear war risks extinction, rough 25. Nukes pose the most existential threat to humankind. 2% of nukes would cause ice age, decimate the vast majority of human population, and risk extinction. But non-intervention solves. Siemens 24 explains that to manage relations with China, Washington should move away from policy innovation and instead explicitly apply principles. Non-interference in politics would mean not implying strategic objective in China. The U.S. can continue support for Taiwan, but it must not publicize symbolic gestures of political support or government cooperation. Contention 2 is multilateralism. Unipolarity is unsustainable. Sustained U.S. interventions crush the shift. Waiter 25 explains that U.S. chartered economy divided politics unstably. Other nations rising to power, many powers balancing at least a decade away. There are 3 major powers. Risk of American overextension means the risks are far greater. 2 of the 3 would inevitably align against the third. The only way forward is to accept that the unipolar era is over. A new method accepts to influence a non-interventionist and restrained foreign policy. Skip the next card. However, cooperation ensures rapid diffusion of green tech, which can solve climate change. Claire 21, an international coalition to gang up on China won't prevent the planet from heating up. Warming is an existential threat and perils survival of humanity. The only way to avert is to avoid a new Cold War with China to keep temperatures from rising, which requires sustained reduction of fossil fuels. This can be separately or together, but each can deny tech and insist that allies only buy equipment. The US and China could cooperate in developing green tech. Skip the rest. Otherwise, warming will cause extinction. Spangenberg 25 explains the wet bulb survival limits are 26 Celsius. Everyone will die at that point. Amazon dieback, accelerate heating, turning into a source. The same is happening to Canadian and Russian forests. The AMC might be the next tipping point. Thus, I affirm and I'm good for cross.
Cool. Let me start. Cross for 3 minutes. Time will start on my first word. You say, let's start on your first contention about South China Sea. You say China's militarizing right now. What's unique about that? China's been militarizing for a long time.
Sure, the argument we make is that the U.S. recent conflicts, specifically Iran and Venezuela, mean that China's increasing militarization has a much higher chance of being used because there's an erosion in international norms and there's a higher chance that they'll see the risks as being the rewards as being worth the risks.
All right. All right, and then you talk about escalation, specifically China with South Korea and Japan. Can you explain the exact scenario?
Sorry, can you which part are you talking about?
Do you mention anything about China escalating in regards to South Korea or Japan? I believe you talked
Oh,
about.
the argument is that any Chinese escalation in this area will draw in allies in the region, like South Korea and Japan. But if they start to escalate, that sets off kind of a chain reaction. The issue is
Yeah,
it's a very
what's the exact scenario that results in such an escalation? Is it China tries to invade Taiwan, or can we get
that's probably the most likely, yeah. But really, any perceived Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, whether it be a more aggressive claim of areas or a direct move to invade, would lead to an escalation.
Cool. What specific action does the affirmative take in the status quo? We already intervened in Venezuela. We can't undo that. So what do we do right now?
Yeah. So what the U.S. does is firmly establish a policy of non-intervention, meaning it declares it's not going to intervene in the future, and the U.S. declaring and the U.S. not intervening in the future ensures that the international norms kind of go away because we know it's not going to intervene, and also that China is more secure about Taiwan because it doesn't perceive us as aggressing against them.
If China knows that the U.S. isn't going to intervene, why wouldn't it just take Taiwan directly?
Okay, sure. So we talk about this in the Siemens 24 card. We can say that we can support Taiwan through various means that aren't necessarily interventionist, like softer means, but the direct aggression that we're taking is too much, and that leads China to lash out as well.
All right. You talk. Cool. Wouldn't international norms have already been eroded if we your first card tells you that, like, when we intervened in Venezuela, international norms eroded. Why wouldn't that still be true? Like,
Sure.
why
So
does
there's two
China
arguments.
suddenly trust us again now that we've, like, supposedly said that we're not going to
Yeah,
intervene?
sure. There's two arguments. First of all, our interventions are still ongoing. You can look to Iran. So the more we do it and the longer we go without a policy of non-intervention, the international norms go worse. But then second of all, a lot of it is premised on the idea that like China believes that we're going to act out aggressively or that there's like this norm that it's allowed to do the same because we're doing it. If we say we're not doing it and then China does it, that kind of goes against the norm we've set.
Alright, so would that mean that we pull out of, like, every single conflict in the world?
It doesn't mean we pull out of every single area that we're in. It means that we stop intervening. So areas that we're in without like legal jurisdiction, yeah, we can't do that anymore.
Cool, thanks for cross. I'll take running prep starting now. Cool, I took 2 minutes, 23 seconds. That leaves me 1 minute, 37 seconds on the clock. Give me a moment to send the file. Alright, if anyone is not ready, please speak up now, or else I'll be giving my negative speech for 7 minutes. I might not necessarily go through all of these cards. I'll let you know which ones I skip. Time will start on my first word. Annegate, let's start with Iran. U.S. presence is currently deterring a blockade. August 26, President Trump stated that U.S. military forces will remain in the region to ensure the Strait of Hormuz stays open. This persistent presence serves as a critical deterrent against regional aggression, maintaining stability in a vital global energy choke point. U.S. naval patrols ensure that energy markets remain functional. Efforts to test and deploy anti-satellite and anti-missile systems of many kinds are accelerating. New hyperglide long-range missiles are emerging, as are hyper-accurate ICBMs equipped with conventional explosions for prompt global strikes, but low collateral damage. The presence of U.S. personnel in the region serves as the only physical barrier to a total maritime blockade. Non-intervention collapses the security guarantee. Nayafizada 26, policy of non-intervention necessitates a U.S. withdrawal from the Persian Gulf. Removing these forces amid an ongoing conflict environment invites a maritime blockade targeting Iranian oil exports and shipping routes. If the U.S. signals that it will no longer intervene to defend its interests, Iran will inevitably seize control of the Strait of Hormuz, effectively shutting down a crucial global energy artery. The result is an immediate supply shock that the current global economy cannot survive, as alternative routes are insufficient to handle the volume of lost exports. Retrenchment does not reduce risk, it magnifies it, as dangers that emerge in the Gulf inevitably reverberate across the Atlantic. A non-interventionist America is an invitation to global anarchy. Supply loss triggers global supply strikes. Closure of the strait cuts off roughly 20% of global oil supply, marking the largest supply disruption in history. This triggers demand destruction, where extreme energy costs force businesses and consumers to spend less, causing economic damage to ripple throughout the U.S. economy. Stagnating GDP makes it more difficult to carve out resources for defense. A military conflict restricting trade through the strait causes a global inflation shock, leads to enduring economic damage, sparking a worldwide recession and a geo-economic crisis that threatens the stability of the global order. High energy costs force a halt in spending, crippling the U.S. economy. Economic collapse leads to systemic war, CBRE 26. A military conflict restricting trade through the strait causes a global supply and inflation shock that leads to enduring economic damage, sparking a worldwide recession and a geoeconomic crisis that threatens the stability of the global order. When the primary stabilizer of a region is removed, the result is never peace. It's a scramble for power. This spiral of escalation between nuclear armed states is the most likely path to a global catastrophe. The collapse of global trade is a project already underway, and its completion would represent the greatest strategic catastrophe in American history. Any miscalculation or failure of communication could trigger a global exchange that would end human civilization as we know it. Global economic collapse terminates the human experiment. But that's not all. Let's go on to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. We'll abbreviate that to IUU. It's decreasing in the status quo and will continue decreasing thanks to automatic ID systems. PU as of March 17th. Governments are starting to make progress against IUU fishing. PSMA prevents, deters, and eliminates IUU fishing by denying port access. Researchers use AIS and public info to rank ports and assign risk levels. Authorities also use it for vessel tracking. Improvements in tech and increased usage of AIS enabled researchers to map 75% of fishing vessel voyages. Risk for non-potty use has gone down. Ability to identify and track vessels using AIS technology has improved significantly, while fishing vessels' use of AIS has increased. Researchers have a better overall picture. Intervention from the Coast Guard is key to enforcement experience agreements and tech. Ellsworth 23. Countering IUU requires expertise in discussion and monitoring, boarding and searching vessels, and legal action. The Coast Guard exercises bilateral law enforcement agreements with over 40 nations. The U.S. has the capacity, technical expertise, and experience most nations lack. The Coast Guard already has agreements with 12 Pacific Island nations as well as several nations in Africa to counter illegal fishing. Otherwise, illegal fishing massively fuels crime and terror. Polling 23. IUU fishing is a security threat, supports illicit networks, narcotics, weapons, wildlife, people, maritime crimes, deprives island governments of needed revenue, crime, armed insurgency, and terrorism. Infamous example is IUU fishing and human trafficking, widely documented. The problem remains pervasive. Global fleets, especially water fishing vessels, illicit fishing ships trafficking cocaine in South America to the US, support insurgent and terrorist groups. Skip the next two cards. Let's go into their first contention about the South China Sea. South China Sea won't escalate. Risks are exaggerated, and countries have vested interest in preserving open trade and rules-based liberal order. Herskovich 17. Leaders and experts exaggerate the dangers of China's South China Sea policy. China has a deep vested interest in trade routes and no interest in military conflict. Beijing does not seek to undermine this order and remains supportive of the international system. Washington and Beijing regularly trade barbs, and the militaries are accustomed to operating in close, suspicious quarters. Regional and global security threat level is low. Chinese decision-making is rational and calibrated. Fuck 19. China has been able to avoid conflict by taking only small bursts of actions. This below the threshold expansion allows China to acquire territories. Chinese actions are calibrated to avoid war. Beijing does not try to provoke a war with its neighbors as it would be too costly and counterproductive. Instead, China is operating from a rational standpoint and conducts its actions based on calculated consideration of consequences. It's zero sum. China incurs more substantive risk with lower likelihood of US intervention. Taffer 19. China's restraint has been intended to mitigate the risk of a US intervention. To manage this risk, China has adopted coercive conduct at only a low level of escalation. Beijing sought to manage its overall risk profile. Beijing was electing to incur more substantial risk in the area with a lower likelihood of US intervention. Ultimately, Judge, what this is telling you is that in the SES, absent US intervention, China has absolutely no reason not to directly escalate and take Taiwan. Taiwan can't do anything about it. In the status quo, US intervention is preventing that. But either way, China won't want to escalate militarily on Taiwan because that would destroy the infrastructure. That would affect the Taiwanese. It wouldn't be useful for their narrative about peaceful reunification. Their international norms argument is entirely non-unique. International norms have been declining for a while now, and furthermore, let's go to our IUU DA. Apply that here. In a case where the U.S. decides to abide by a principle of non-intervention, that means it no longer enforces illegal fishing across the globe. That would be massively unpopular with 40 other countries, which would absolutely wreck our standing either way. Then they talk about multilateralism. Again, that we cross-apply this argument too. 40 countries all agree with the U.S. Having military intervention, having control over the oceans. If we were to abide by non-intervention, that would massively collapse that and actually turn the impacts. Ultimately, it will accede to their framework. The negative should win this debate. Thank you. And I stand across.
Everyone for cross.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let's start that now. Okay, let's start on the top of the Iran argument. You say U.S. presence is currently deterring a blockade, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So you're telling me that without presence, that there's going to be like if we don't continually attack them, then there's going to be like a massive spike in oil prices or something, or we're going to see like Iran taking over the strait.
Yeah, essentially, if the US were to pull out of the Iran conflict right now, we would see Iran take over the Strait of Hormuz, and that would be bad on multiple
Okay,
levels.
cool. We've been in a ceasefire with Iran for a couple of days now, and we've seen oil prices decrease, and we've seen a stabilization. How does that interact with your arguments about the strait being taken over?
Yeah, so the ceasefire, like, we still maintain that level of, like, the possibility that we reignite war, and that's stabilizing. If we were to say, like, suddenly, "Oh, we'll pull out and we'll never intervene again," there's no reason why Iran doesn't just, like, take the opportunity in order to, like, go back and, like, take the Strait of Hormuz. Like, why wouldn't they? The US can't do anything about it.
Okay,
And yes, you're going to say diplomatic means, but that isn't effective in, like, such a case. Like, we've been trying diplomatic means, it hasn't worked.
okay, cool. Let's talk about your IUU argument. Do you read any impacts here?
Yeah, the impact is like terror across the globe, like humanitarian impacts, climate change, like that turns your thing on warming because like otherwise like massive overfishing like collapses ecosystems. It's bad for the planet. It's like generally it's all across a bad
Okay,
thing.
okay, cool. Let's talk about actually, yeah, let's go back to the Iran argument. What's the alternative? Keep doing what we're doing?
Yeah, so the alternative is the US pursues a specific military action that actually like claims back the strait. We don't have the exact specifics because I'm not a military analyst. I don't know how, but like pulling out the negative doesn't propose like a specific plan to resolve the Iran conflict, but what we can tell you is that pulling out right now would trigger massive impacts. That would be negative.
Okay, that's fine. We've seen like several economic recessions in the last couple of decades. Why haven't they triggered the impacts in the CBRE 26 evidence?
Yeah, because Iran's consistent control of the Strait of Hormuz gives it access to like 20% of the world's oil supply, and this isn't something that like happens once and we can bounce back. This is consistent control, which would, in one way or another, greatly affect the world order
Okay.
that we
In
have
the
today.
event that we pull out and Iran seizes the strait, does oil prices spike and like the oil market goes down a lot? Or oil
Yeah,
market increase, whatever? Is that what you're telling
yeah,
me?
that's where our
Okay.
evidence is.
Okay, cool. So increasing demand but less supply for oil.
Sure.
Okay, cool. I'll stop press there, and I'm going to take some running prep time. I'll let you know when it's done. Cool, I'll stop it there. 20 left. I'm reading like 2 new cards, I guess, in this speech. I'll put it in the... Yeah, I'll put it in the file share. It's going to be down the neg and down the F. Is everyone good? Cool. In that case, one sec. In that case, let's start the time now. Okay, cool. Let's start on the top of the Irana argument. A few arguments here. First of all, it fails because there's actively a ceasefire right now. That means we don't necessarily need non-intervention to secure the strait. His cards are outdated. That means instead of intervening, if we abide by a policy of non-intervention, that allows diplomacy to take over, which ensures that there's not going to be escalation. He'll tell you that diplomacy fails, but it's not true because we've actively seen it work with the ceasefire right now. Second of all, turn the argument because he directly tells you in cross-ex that in the absence of US, if there's going to be Iran taking over the strait, then oil prices spike. That is a net good because it means we transition to renewables. Roll on Shia 22. We can never be energy independent while we rely on a fuel controlled by the global market and susceptible to international conflict and manipulation. We'll get into our multilateralism argument on the AF in a second, but we tell you that the only way to transition to renewable technology, which is available if we cooperate, is through not having oil. So increase in oil prices is net positive. Finally, on the economy argument, it ultimately fails. We've seen several recessions in the last few years, and we haven't seen anything close to any kind of extinction. At the very least, it's going to take a lot longer to actualize because there are other sources of energy now that differ from the past, things like renewable technology that is increasingly available. So at worst, climate change is a much shorter timeline. Now let's go into the IUU argument. There's a few blatant problems here. First of all, he never contests the definition we read of non-intervention. It's not interfering. We'll clarify that further through an IEP card from Mosley in 25. It says interventionism is characterized by the use or threat of force or coercion to alter a political and cultural situation. But then look at his own evidence that he reads in case. This is the one in the evidence he reads at the bottom, telling you that we have 40 different agreements with countries. That's Ellsworth 23 from his own case. That means this is definitionally not political interference because we actively have agreements. And it says, quote, the U.S. Coast Guard already has agreements with 12 Pacific Island nations to counter illegal fishing. Insofar as that's the case, then it's not interference or intervention to these agreements. It's simply enforcing the law. Thus, you can turn the whole argument. Let's go into the outside of the case because they make some pretty significant drops here. First, we're going to go for the second mention of multilateralism. It's the biggest impact in the round. We'll extend some arguments here. First, unipolarity is unsustainable. That's Waiter 25. That's because US exerting its power over the world means that we can't actually agree with or work with other countries, but that means we're never going to come to common sense agreements. We treat the world like we're still the only power, but there's two other powers in the world now that we have to work with. If we keep going the way we are, it's not going to end well. Swain 23 tells you that if we keep overstretching our military, there's going to be wars and existential threats. That's because we don't have the control that we used to. However, cooperation ensures a rapid diffusion of green technology. That's Claire 21. If we work with other countries like China, we can actually use a green tech that they've been so good at proliferating, and that's how we stop climate change. Extend the Spangenberg 25 card. It's the best extinction link in this round. That's because Spangenberg 25 tells you that in years, if we don't have green technology, then we're going to see massive extinction due to an increase in temperatures and unsustainability of the environment. The only response he says is that, oh, actually, if we leave the agreement, we're going to have 40 countries that don't agree with us anymore. But A, we've disproved this link. That's because leaving this, abiding by principle of non-intervention doesn't mean leaving IUU agreements because they're not intervention. But then B, I fail to see how not abiding by IUU agreements with other nations just distracts us from working with countries like China and Russia. Worst case scenario, not abiding with those agreements is a lower harm than working with these other countries like China and Russia that help us give climate change arguments, especially because he doesn't read any extinction link on the IUU arguments. The impact of this is ultimately extinction. It's the best link you have in this round because he doesn't actually respond to the links here. He just says nothing about green technology. Now, let's go on the SCRS argument. The only argument he says is that, oh, it's not going to escalate because China is rationalist, but that's non-responsive to the cards we read. Specifically, we tell you that when the US is overly intervening, that means that China, because of its a new militarism and because of our new international norms in Venezuela and Iran, want to get more involved. So even if they don't directly invade, their increasing militarism leads to scenarios we tell you because there's going to be more chance of miscalculation. That's the South Korea and Japan scenarios that we reach you at the bottom. And second of all, it doesn't respond to the argument that more recent international norms from Iran and Venezuela or triggers impacts. The cards are outdated. But ultimately, we're going for multilat. The ballot is very cleanly decided on green tech.
Cool, thank you. I'll be taking running prep starting now. All right. I think that's all the time I have. Is anyone not ready? I won't be reading any new cards, but I'll read a card from my 1NC doc. All right. If everyone is ready, time will start on my first word for 6 minutes. Let's start on my case. First of all, on Iran. First, they say that currently diplomacy is working. We've seen a ceasefire that somehow is helping, but oil prices are still above average. And they completely ignore our response, which is that if we cede complete control to Iran, they now control oil prices. They now control oil prices and have the freedom to do whatever they want. That's bad. That's bad for America and for the world. Generally, we read multiple cards that tell you that. Specifically, they ignore our argument that when we agree to non-intervene, that means that we no longer hold the threat of intervening over Iran, meaning that they no longer have any reason to continue with their ceasefire or any other agreement. Then let's go into their turn about renewables. Number one, renewables. This is a double bind. They say that we have other sources like renewables that will aid in our transition from oil. Number one, if we already have enough sources, and their turn is entirely like not important. But number two, if we don't have enough sources, that's still bad. That means that lacking oil means that our impacts still happen. But furthermore, we need oil to actually manufacture renewables in the first place. It's not like we suddenly get rid of oil and suddenly renewables fill in the gap. It's a transition, not a complete. We get rid of all and suddenly the other one fills in entirely. Which is exactly what receding from the Iran conflict would do. Then let's go on to IUU. They say that it's not intervention because it's agreed to by 40 states, but again, this is on international water, and not every state has agreed. Furthermore, they don't read anything in their definition about the consent of the states. So again, this is still military intervention. The only definition they read is the policy of non-intervening. Then finally, they say that we have no specific impact on IUU. We read multiple. There's terror. There's human rights abuses. There's climate change. They agree that all of those things are bad. But furthermore, we tell you that this specifically causes conflict, because escalating tensions like lack of resources that forces states to go to war over these resources, and that incentivizes conflict. We'll read a card, Pomeroy 18. Overharvesting fisheries is resulting in poverty, economic stress, conflict, and escalating violence. A feedback cycle is created, growing population increase, the number of people dependent on fish and fishers. Result is reduced food security, further depleting fish. Illegal fishing is leading to increased conflict from coastal fisheries may correlate with transnational threats such as smuggling, piracy, and kidnapping, fueling insurgency and insecurity, engaging with terrorist organizations, self-reinforcing fish wars, deteriorating social, economic, and political conditions, including poverty, food insecurity, and loss of income and livelihoods. Instability and civil unrest are destabilizing national, regional, and global security concerns. Then that actually turns everything that they read on their case about escalation. Because IUU fishing is escalating concerns all over the globe, that makes the risk of conflict more likely. Now let's go to their SCAs. They drop essentially all of our cards on this topic. We tell you the South China Sea won't escalate. They don't tell you why that's not true. And we tell you a turn. The U.S. specifically deters China from going for Taiwan. They also don't respond to that. Cross apply that to their argument about allied draw-in. Like the entire region has a vested interest in avoiding war because trade routes go through there. They have no reason to like wreck their own economies. So effectively, South China Sea war isn't going to happen. But even then, they say that there's no IUU. There's no reason why us non-intervening in terms of IUU fishing affects our ability to work with China and Russia. It does specifically because of escalation. Escalating tensions makes it more difficult because it escalates any tensions that existing nations have with China or Russia, making them less likely to accede to any U.S. demands. That also accelerates the U.S.'s losing control on things, as my opponent alludes to, um, which turns all of their impacts. At the end of the day, Judge, you're going to be voting for us. Number one, on Iran, they don't tell you anything of substance. Eff- Um, eff- Effectively removing U.S. military from Iran would cede control of oil to them, and that would be that would be bad on multiple levels. Like oil prices increase, American control decreases. They agree that those are all bad things. Ultimately, that results in recessions, that results in war. That's an extinction impact, weighed on the same level as them. But not only that, we also have a full link chain on IUUs. The only response they make is that 40 countries agree, but again, not every country has agreed, and it's international waters. They say there's no specific impact. We tell you multiple. We also access their war impact, leading to extinction. Then they're not winning on any of their arguments. They completely dropped all of our responses on the SES, and furthermore, our turn on multilateralism still stands. Judge, you're voting negative every time. Thank you.
Cool. I'll take my remaining 20 of prep, and now I'll start the 2AR. Okay, cool. Order is going to be Iran, IUUs, and then the AF. Everyone good? Great. We'll start that. Now, let's start on Iran. There's two reasons you're dropping it. First is the turn. Extend Roland Shia 22. We tell you that you can never be energy independent if you rely on oil. However, we do have enough renewables to solve right now. That's Claire 21 from Case. The issue is that we're still dependent on oil because we still have it available to us. Thus, we're going to take the cheaper, easier to access oil if we can. That's what leads to climate change, and climate change leads to extinction. That's Spangenberg 25 from Case. However, in the absence of oil, we have to turn to renewables, which is made able by our non-intervention policy through multilateralism. We'll get into on the outside of the case. And they tell you specifically in cross-examination that oil prices rise if Iran seizes control of the strait. That means that if there's it's the same amount of demand, but a decreased supply, people are going to be less able to get access to it, and so they have to turn to alternative methods. Even if we don't explain to you exactly how it happens, it should be obvious that insofar as there's going to be less oil available, then there is an increased transition to other forms of energy because you need some form of energy in order to survive. That means that there is at least some link to the multipolarity argument about renewables. Second, they don't extend any impact in Iran, so you can just drop the argument overall. They don't extend their impact cards, and they don't extend the extinction link, so you can't vote on the Iran argument. Now on IUUs. You can drop this because it's not intervention. They never read you a counter definition of their intervention. We tell you that intervention is specifically interfering in others' matters. However, their own Ellsworth evidence from Case tells you that we have 40 different agreements with nations, and that's why it's not. They have two responses to this. First of all, they say it's still intervention because, even if we have these agreements. And second, they say not every country agrees and it's international waters. On the first argument, it's not intervention insofar as we have agreement with them because then we are not interfering. Just like when the police makes an agreement with someone and they arrest you, they're not interfering because they have legal standing. We are not interfering because we have legal standing with all the countries. And then the argument that it's international waters or it's not every country, they never read that in case or have any evidence for it. There's no evidence that we're interfering in other countries that we don't have consent to do international illegal fishing. So you can drop that as well. On the outside of the case, we're not going for SES. We're going for the multilateralism argument because it's badly mishandled. They never respond to anything. Extend Weight 25. Unipolarity is unsustainable because of the increase in two other powers in the world, Russia and China. That means that we can never sustain our sole position at the top. And Swain 23 tells you that if we keep doing what we're doing, there's going to be transition wars in the process, and we're going to shatter our cooperation. Because if we keep pretending like we're at the top while we're not, that means no other country will actually cooperate with us. However, the solvency is a non-intervention. That's Claire 21, which never goes responded to. If we stop intervening in other countries where we can't, like Iran and Venezuela, then other countries are more likely to cooperate with us. That leads to an increase in green technology. That's Claire 21, which specifically tells you that we are able to ramp up renewables as long as we do it together. However, absent renewables, warming will cause extinction. That's Spangenberg 25. Ultimately, there are basically no responses on the multipolarity argument except this IU argument, which we've disproved. It's the best thing to extinction around because it's the only impact that's actually extended and that has full warranting. So you can vote on that. Good round, Ryan. Thanks for the debate.
Good round. Thank you
Thank you
so
all
much.
for judging.
Thank you, judges. You did really well again.
Oh, you did really well as well.